Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of The Next. I am your host, Mike Walker, and today we're going to be talking with Marianne Eaves. She is a master distiller and consultant for bourbon. And so we're going to get into the whole topic of innovation in bourbon. And who better to talk to us about this is a top 30, under 30 Forbes winner. Along with being the first master distiller as a female since Prohibition. She's part of documentaries and all sorts of activity in the bourbon and spirits world. And we're going to talk to her about, what does it mean to be a bourbon? What's the process to create this? And what's the role of technology? And how can we use technology to innovate this 150 plus year old tradition. So, like all episodes, the show notes and links will be on vnextpod.com. That's vnextpod.com. So with that, let's just go ahead and jump right into it. Marianne, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much, Mike.
Yeah, so, for folks that are listening, we talk about a whole range of things. We talk about, artificial intelligence, blockchain, quantum computing, all these, highly technical things. And, you might be surprised today to hear us talking about bourbon. And, what's up with that? Is there really any innovation around that? And hopefully today, we dispel some of those myths, because I think we're going to get into some interesting things that we're doing in this space. And who better to have this conversation with is with you, Marianne, who, you're the first female master distiller since Prohibition, right?
That's correct. For bourbon. Yep.
For bourbon. Yeah. And so maybe tell us a little bit about what you're doing right now and a little bit about your journey on how you got there.
So I'm a spirits consultant. I call myself a freelance distiller. I left the big kind of corporate world in my early 30s. I'm still in my early 30s, but I decided to strike out on my own so that I could pursue, new innovations and get out of bourbon for a little bit, although I find myself back in it quite frequently. So I came up through the industry working for companies like Brown Foreman, and eventually got my feet wet in a more of an entrepreneurial role, building the Old Taylor distillery into Castle and Key. And after those experiences and about a decade in the industry, I realized that there's just so much more that I have to learn, and honestly, more that I want to contribute across the nation, more than just to one brand.
Right. And so for you as a consultant, what does kind of a day in the life look like for you, Marianne?
It's a lot of emails and daydreaming, a lot of whiskey tasting. It's interesting, every day is different. This depends on what I've got kind of who's coming my way, who's asking questions, where I am in process with each one of these projects. It's pretty varied, but I can do basically everything that I need to remote, except for the physical production of things.
So let's talk about that for a second. So, we're in the middle of a global pandemic. How is that working out for, kind of an industry where it does require you to smell things and taste things?
Well, thank gosh for FedEx and UPS. We just basically, send samples back and forth. Um, I do a lot of tasting just from the road, and I'll write my notes and send them and develop blends from there. Doing a lot of like maturation analysis and that sort of thing at the moment. Yeah, so it's basically just utilizing the mail and retrieving the samples wherever I happen to be.
Now, I'm a bit jealous because I live in Ohio, and you can't mail bourbon to Ohio, unfortunately. So, even if I wanted to do what you do, I just couldn't do it. I'd have to move. But and I've kind of got a little bit of a shout out behind me as well. You might see it on my shelf back here. I got a
Mhm.
bottle of Woodford, kind of one of my staple go tos. But that aside, let's talk about kind of the art and science of bourbon a little bit. In what makes a bourbon a bourbon?
So bourbon is different from global whiskey for several reasons. I like to use the bourbon is whiskey, but not all whiskey is bourbon.
Right.
Like your square is a rectangle, but a rectangle is not a square. So there are essentially four rules that make whiskey whiskey. It has to be distilled below 190, has to be made from grains. Can't be bottled below 80 proof and has to go into a barrel of some kind for a specified length of time. And it varies depending on where that is, except for corn whiskey, which doesn't have to be aged. For bourbon, there's a bunch more layers of regulation. So instead of 190, it has to be distilled below 160. Can't go into the barrel above 125 proof. It has to go into a new charred oak barrel. The grain recipe, it has to be at least 51% corn. Um, can't add anything to it except pure water. For straight whiskey, it's got to be at least 2 years. If you don't want to put a age statement on the bottle, it's got to be at least 4 years. And then again, can't be bottled below 80 proof.
Wow. And so I spent a lot of time in Germany, and it sounds a lot like the German purity law in a lot of ways, but for whiskey, right?
Right.
So,
It was actually these regulations were precursor, and the Bottle and Bond Act in particular were precursors to the Pure Food and Drug Act. So they were regulating whiskeys before they were regulating anything else.
well, back then, they were using it for, medicine and, hey, if your kid's having trouble sleeping, just give them a little thimble of, whiskey or what have you. Um,
Absolutely.
so what I found fascinating about your background, Marianne, was you didn't go to school to go into this industry. You went into chemical engineering, and maybe tell me a little bit about how this kind of comes together. Because when people think of this, and even as you described it, it's, well, you gotta distill it, you put it in a barrel, you let it age, or some kind of general requirements. But where does kind of the chemistry part come into all this?
Every single step of the process in making bourbon has an application for a chemical engineer. I very nerdily like to say you use every major unit operation that you learn in a chemical engineering curriculum in the distillery day in, day out making bourbon. So from the composition of the grain that you choose to how you cook it, the times and temperatures, how you ferment it, the times and temperatures, the yeast that you choose, and looking at those metabolism reactions and the kinetics of the yeast itself. And then, of course, distillation, how you choose to express those flavors at the end of it. And then there's all sorts of crazy magic and mystery in the maturation as well.
Right, right. And in your mind, having this background, did you feel like you had a little bit of an advantage to, most other distillers, where you kind of understood these concepts?
I do. I when I started working for Brown Forman as a chemical engineering student, so I was there as an intern. It was really just a job. I had no passion for whiskey. I really had no idea, anything about the processes to making spirits, except for one distillation lab that I had done as a chemical engineering student. So I really didn't have an appreciation for the nuance and beauty of spirits. I think that having the chemical engineering background definitely gives me a different insight into the way that these flavors are produced. There are tons of books out there, and people maybe watch an episode too many of Moonshiners. You think that it's really simple. You just throw some stuff in a vat and throw yeast in it, and eventually it'll turn into something you can distill. And all you got to do is throw this copper thing over a fire, and voila. But really, it's much more technical than that.
Well, Marianne, you're forgetting you've got to hide it in the middle of the woods somewhere,
Yes.
and
That exactly.
so, I want to dive into some of these aspects here in a little bit because I think this matches really well with some of the innovations that are happening just overall in the spirit space. But before we get there, talking about some of the things that you're doing now, you've been working with some high profile folks. You've been working with Peyton Manning on his new line. Maybe tell me a little bit about what that was like, the process. How did you get something special for that particular product line?
Yeah, absolutely. So, two of the 40 investors that own the Sweetens Cove Golf Course reached out to me as they were recommended to me through the production facility where they had already decided that would be doing the bottling for their product. So they had already found 100 barrels of this 13-year-old Tennessee produced bourbon. It was in Kentucky at the time when they purchased it, so they kidnapped it from Kentucky and brought it back home to Tennessee. And I got the fun job of tasting all the barrels and assembling these different blends. My process is pretty unique and in depth. I taste every single one of the barrels actually twice. So
Mm.
I'll taste it first at cast strength and then dilute it a little bit. When you add water, you actually don't get as much of the influence of the alcohol, and you're able to detect defects better. So I taste every barrel twice and write some pretty detailed notes so that when I get to the point where I'm ready to blend, I already know I have a great understanding of what is available to me across the stock. I can't come out with a blend that's like chocolate covered cherry if not one of the barrels happens to have that note expressed. So I'll know, what is possible to make. And then if there are any kind of on borderline unbalanced barrels that I want to keep an eye on as far as how they would impact a blend, or on the other side of the coin, really really special barrels that I would actually be heartbroken if they were hidden in a blend. So
Right.
that's just a really fun, very hands-on process for me.
Wow. I mean, that's amazing to hear. And so, what I think I heard you say is, you've found kind of this treasure trove of 13-year-old bourbon, and you go through your very specific process. Now, is there any like modifications that you do, shifting of the environment that they're in, or anything along those lines that affect the flavor at all, or is it just about kind of blending things, etc.?
Well, it's interesting, every day, every week, every month that whiskey sits in the barrel, the flavor is changing.
Mm.
So when I'm ready to start blending, my client better be ready to start bottling,
Right.
because the longer it sits in the barrel, the more likely that my blend recipe, the different barrels that I've chosen to go into it could vary, and that the flavor overall could change. If they're ready to barrel it within a month or two even, I'm not too concerned about it. If I'm creating a blend today that they're not going to be able to produce until say next year, we might want to go back and revisit and take another round of samples and just confirm.
Right. And what are some of the other projects you're working on?
I'm really excited. I've got a bunch of exciting stuff going on. A handful of whiskey projects. One is international. So I'm going to be helping a couple, a woman who started a vineyard in China, the first premium vineyard in China. She's now looking to start the first whiskey distillery in China.
Mm.
So I'm helping her develop those recipes, define the processes, train the team, identify and source the ingredients, and that's something I'm super excited about, opening a completely new market and creating, kind of the first uh, expectations for taste of a new country of whiskey.
Right.
So that one's really fun. I'm still continuing to innovate for sweetens. That the first batch was a straight bourbon. As we move forward, they're embracing my creativity a little bit more and giving me the reins in what we source and how we assemble the next batches. So the very next release from Sweetens is a product that I haven't seen done in the market. There's hundreds of if not thousands of different types of blended spirits out there in the world. So who knows if somebody maybe tried it and I just haven't heard about it. But this
Right.
one I'm really excited about as well. I'm also doing a handful of projects that are outside of whiskey. So I've got a brandy, vermouth, and gin project in California with Hoops Vineyard. So Lindsay Hoops is an incredible woman and took over her family winery business from her father and wanted to kind of reinvent it and start a totally new kind of side of the business. The fires in 2017, unfortunately, kickstarted that idea a little bit because they had all of this. Basically, the entire crop from that year was unusable for wine anyway. But for me, the opportunity to turn some smoky Cabernet into a beautiful brandy is really exciting.
Right.
So working on that, there's a distillery construction plan underway for that project. So all the nerdy process details, figuring out how I can use my experience in whiskey and bring that into a smoky aged brandy and some other products. I'm also working on a couple collaboration brands. Some one of them I've been talking about this for a while, and I guess the universe has finally manifested it. But um, when thinking about innovation in the spirit space, a lot of folks are looking at the grains, they're looking at the barrels, they're looking at proof and age and all those sorts of things. But what I want to do is get to another level, go even deeper into not just the source of the ingredient, but the treatment of the ingredient. As it goes into the process. And this is looking at it much more from a culinary perspective, because this is something that chefs absolutely obsess over. The effect of heat and time and temperature on an onion totally changes, its texture and the flavor and how it will influence the other flavors around it. So
Right.
I'm just really excited to get involved. It's a collaboration with a chef in Tennessee, and we're going to be creating a very culinary focused line of spirits. Kind of the motto is, tradition is important, but flavor is more important.
Right. Right. No, that's really cool. And speaking of innovation, I mean, there's tons of innovation that's happening in this particular space, and the food industry specifically. I mean, you talked a little bit about China. We're finding that authenticity of alcohol, it has been a rampant challenge, especially in the wine industry, with people refilling bottles of wines on airplanes and this and that. Do you what technologies are you employing in your business, or recommending to your customers that they use to help fight some of these issues, or even help in the creation process of their spirit?
There's been some incredible advances, and even while I was still working for Brown Forman, they were very conscious of counterfeit spirits, Jack Daniels in particular. That there were constantly, and a lot of it was in China,
Yeah.
but they'll hang on to the bottles and then refill it with something else, and it could just be like flavored vodka. like, or not flavored, but colored vodka.
Wow.
Sometimes they would decide to put flavors in it, but sometimes not. But yeah, so using analysis like HPLC and GC to look at the specific flavor components. You'd have to go into a bar. You could recognize some of it by just the color. You know, there's definitely some spectrophotometry type of processes that you can use to identify the wavelengths that would tell you this is natural bourbon that they've put in the bottle. So that's, one more check mark that hopefully at least it's a whiskey.
Right.
Maybe it's your bourbon, maybe it's not, or it's some kind of artificial color, and then that would be a dead giveaway right from the get go. But there are lots of different technologies and analysis that you could employ if you suspected, a counterfeit spirit on the shelf. You'd have to just go in there and pull it off and say, "Hey, I'm gonna caught you."
Right. Now, we talked earlier about, the very humanistic side of this, and there's a lot of tradition that's baked to bourbon specifically. I work for this small little company. You might have heard of them, Microsoft.
Yeah.
Um, and we kind of get our fingers into a lot of different things, right? And one customer that we have is actually a customer in the Netherlands that has their own whiskey distillery in an old abandoned coal mine of all places, where they keep the barrels. And what was interesting about their chief nose officer, so they have a chief, she wanted to be
So-
a CXO, so go for it, right? Um, so the chief nose officer said, "Hey, I want to partner with a consulting firm, and I want to see where artificial intelligence can help augment the things that I do." And
Mhm.
so she went from approximately 70 whiskey recipes to 70 million recipes. Now, it's a whole different question of, sifting through which is the right one. But,
Uh-huh.
her whole goal was to, one, have a whole degree of options, and then two, marry that with consumers' taste buds and taking data from consumers on what they like and they don't like and matching those together. Now, for you, there's a certain purity level to bourbon, and there's certain tradition and tactile type of component to it. But how does those types of methods resonate with you? Do you think that's something that can be employed in this industry, or maybe it already is? What do you think?
I don't know how many people are actively engaging with artificial intelligence in bourbon just yet. When I moved from Brown Forman to start up what was the Old Taylor Distillery with these two guys in Kentucky, my brother is actually a data scientist, and he was working on uh, uh, grain genetics and that sort of thing with a big company. I don't know if he would want me to say or not, but he's got his own company now called Red Pole. But he was just asking me. He's like, why don't we gather some data and see what kind of bourbon you should make? And I kind of brushed him off because I was like, well, but I want to make what I want to make.
Right.
So it was this was my opportunity to really take everything from scratch. I think after now having done that, that's super interesting and probably extremely smart to go by what consumers are actually purchasing and the flavor trends and their preferences for sure. I am aware of a new technology. I don't know if they've gotten really past a prototype at this point, but it's a barrel sensor. Their initial goal was to monitor volume,
Hmm.
but now also looking at temperature and investigating some other types of analysis that they could install in this probe that would sit, in the barrel, be installed in the barrel head and sit in the barrel for the life of aging and give you some other interesting data. They had approached me about being involved in helping them develop algorithms and ways that their technology could pick the barrels for the blends and that sort of thing. And I guess
And you got to make
I
sure that the angels aren't taking too much, right?
yes, absolutely. And there's also a potential tax benefit if you can get a accurate read on exactly the volume that's in the barrel, that would save distillers a ton of tax money because they're taxed on the proof gallons, the pure alcohol that went into the barrel year after year until they dump it. So it's the same amount of taxes that they're paying, even if by the time they finally dump it, it's empty or half full or a third full or whatever that happens to be. So that could
Right.
be huge, annual savings potentially for folks.
Nice. Now, if you kind of put your future hat on, what do you think are going to be some of the kind of innovative either technologies or methods that you think will be employed in your industry?
Um, Gosh, I think that there's so many opportunities. In distillation, I feel like there are lots of companies that are using different types of programming to monitor still operations and get consistency and that sort of thing. But I think even before that, in the cooking and the fermentation process, to employ more automation and ensure that cooks are they proceed in a consistent way every single time, which will lead to more consistency in the flavor of the what you have to ferment, which hopefully will lead to more consistency in the flavor of the beer that you're producing to go into the still to be hopefully distilled in a more consistent way. But I think also taking in more than just the data in the system itself, but looking at external data and how that will impact the flavors as well. I don't know that there's been many studies on the change in effects of the climate that day. I'm distilling on a 100-degree Kentucky day versus
Right.
a -10 winter day. That's definitely going to change the conditions, and it will absolutely change the flavors that are produced. So bringing all of that data and integrating that into the system to figure out how the system should run to get the most similar output, if
Right.
that's what your goal is.
Right. Yeah. So, what do you think about people talking about these kind of synthetic whiskeys and
Mm.
bourbons? What's your position on that?
So there's a couple things that are happening right now. There's the one product that's out there that they say it's a combination of the individual chemicals that are the flavors that make up bourbon. So if you looked at this product, I forget what it's called, and I probably shouldn't say it anyway. But because I just rolled my eyes, but if you look at this product underneath a microscope, or run it through a GC, that the peaks and valleys would be identical. However, I can tell you, even if you have an identical analysis, the taste and the mouth feel could be very different,
Mm,
significantly different. So there's that one, which I think is um, it takes all of it. It takes bourbon and turns it purely into science. There's no, art or nature involved. It's all, lab created flavors mixed together on a bench top.
right.
And then there's, the other kind of synthetic aging, forced aging kind of processes, which, again, they're trying to say we can get you a 20-year age profile in 5 minutes. So
Mm.
I don't know. Yeah, exactly. Again, I
It's the
think
Impossible Burger for bourbon, right?
right. Well, and then I don't mind the technology of the Impossible Burger, because I think what they're doing for the environment and in the world is just so wonderful. I prefer the Beyond Burger personally, but when I think about this forced aging and that sort of thing, what it makes me think is. Um, you are taking the aging process and turning it into this homogeneous output. So everything that goes in comes out and tastes exactly the same. But it's that's not the case for natural aging. Two barrels in the warehouse aging right next to one another can come out with significantly different flavor characteristics, which is why, I do what I do with a product like Sweet and Scope.
Right.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. So, I kind of look at this akin to what has happened in other industries. So, if you take the music industry, you've got iTunes or Spotify or what have you, and I could have a billion songs in my pocket, no problem. It's got a certain level of sound quality, etc. But if I want to sit down and I want to enjoy the music and kind of have an experience, now we're seeing kind of records come back
Mm.
and having this kind of more analog feel. And I kind of feel that that's probably, what we're seeing this in lots of different spaces. We're seeing this in the book space. People are starting to have libraries again and really appreciate, hardbound books and having a library. And so, I oftentimes talk about we are analog individuals trying to live in a digital world, and we're trying to force that, but the challenge is that doesn't work for the types of experiences that we want to have. If we're having a bourbon with our friends and family, etc., we don't want it to be kind of this plain vanilla experience. We want something that we know, even if it's just in our heads, and that's okay. I mean, it's your reality, but having that, I know that this was aged, 8 years. There was this process, and I feel like I'm drinking some sort of history, and I can enjoy and have a great conversation. I think as much technology as we can push at, great, and that may be a normal kind of day to day thing. But when you want to create and foster experiences, you can't go wrong with the El
Mm.
Natural way of doing things. I mean, what do you think? Am I talking crazy talk here, or what do you think?
No, I completely agree with you. Have you had an opportunity to watch Neat, the bourbon film?
I
It's called
did.
The Story of Bourbon. So the romance in the words that you're saying, it made me think of that documentary. Absolutely, thinking about the product as an evolution of time and the impact of nature, and that you really should be it's almost like transporting back in time, and it's something to be enjoyed and savored and that sort of thing. I will say, you said, well, maybe it's okay for like a day-to-day process.
Right.
Like if you're taking
Well,
whiskey and
like if
throwing
you're
it in a canned cocktail,
yeah,
sure.
yeah, that's what I'm talking about. I'm like, if you're like
Yeah.
mixing it and all that stuff, then that's fine. But if I'm
Yes.
drinking it neat, I don't know. Maybe I'm a purist. I don't know.
No, I agree with you.
um, so as we start to wrap up, I always like to ask my guests, kind of doing this backward reflection. If you had to do something differently in your career, um, and kind of getting that DeLorean and head back 10 years, what would be a thing that you did that you would either like to do better, or you're like, hey, I made a huge mistake and I'd like to change that. What would one of those things be that you think people would really kind of gravitate towards?
Hmm. Gosh.
And I
I
didn't warn
think
you about that question either, because I was looking for this type of response.
Yeah, going back and thinking about how my career has evolved, it was navigating through, kind of corporate politics and finding my way in that type of environment, while also um, looking for inspiration to be creative and that sort of thing. I was very fortunate to work in research and development where they embrace creativity. However, unless there was a brand ready for, that was aligned with whatever I was making, it would never see the light of day. So it was kind of like creation, but for what end? Just for fun, that's great. But when you're being paid by you also have to consider the needs of the folks that are writing your check.
Right. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So the next opportunity that I had to work and start a distillery from scratch at Castle and Key, I really thought it was so cool to be able to include some of this old equipment in our new processes and that sort of thing. I would say I wish that I had stood my ground a little bit more and invested in more upgrades and more technology and that sort of thing. Because uh, I started that distillery with a lot of 100 year old motors and
Oh, wow.
vessels and that sort of thing, and it made the efficiency of the operations a little bit different than they evolved into later. But I think trusting my gut a little bit more and pushing for some of those upgrades and efficiency would have helped us to grow and also relieved a little bit of my personal stress throughout the growth of that project. It was cool to be able to tell that story. And another thing, as a chemical engineer, as a process nerd, I was thinking about this at one point, like, so I came into this distillery 50 years after they had shut down, and got to go through and look at how they laid everything out and kind of decode why they chose to put things where they did and decide to put in my own process. And now I'm thinking, the next 50 years, somebody's going to come in there and they're just going to be scratching their heads looking around like, what? Because there was this side of our decision making that was, we want to disturb the aesthetics and the history of the site as little as possible.
Right.
So there already happens to be a hole for a pipe across the distillery. Let's not drill a new hole. Let's reroute the entire system so that we can go through that existing hole.
Right.
So somebody's going to be like, all right, the equipment's here and the tank's there, but you sent the pipe all the way over there.
Let's just use that
So,
as a decoration. We won't worry
yeah,
about using that pipe.
yeah, yeah. So just some funny things like that. Like, of course, the historical preservation is important, but there's also the technical and more what do I want to say? Uh, Practical
Yeah.
side of creating, processes and running pipe and making things work that we kind of push to the wayside in times where maybe I feel like it should have been more present at the forefront. But
Right.
it's going and making beautiful spirits, and that's the most important thing.
That's awesome. And so like you said, kind of how I kind of recapped, some of that, that romanticism, that historical. I'm a huge history buff. I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio. It was known for its deep German culture, beer brewing. They were the before Prohibition, at least they were the number one distributor of beer in the world, which
Wow.
was interesting. But so yeah, so when I choose different things that I consume, I like to look at kind of the history of it, and probably most importantly, maybe it's because I'm anal retentive, I don't know, but kind of that purity aspect, that yes, there was a bit of a formulaic, more ritualistic type of process to this, and it just makes it have more character. I don't know. That's just me. But yeah, I watched Neat when it, I think, first came out. I think it was in 2018 ish,
That
19.
that sounds right. Yeah.
Um, yeah, I mean, great documentary. You did a phenomenal job. And it definitely went and explored every nook and cranny of bourbon. So I'd definitely recommend folks check that out. But you know, if people want to get in contact with you, what's the best way folks can reach out to you?
I think that probably the best way and the most likely way that I'll reach back out is to go to my website, marianneeaves.com, and fill out the contact form and get in touch with me that way. Or you can bypass the form and just go directly info@marianneeaves.com. Shoot me an email. If you want to just engage socially, I'm on Instagram and Facebook. It's Marianne BMD, Bourbon Master Distiller. And yeah,
Nice.
posting pictures of my baby and booze.
Babies and booze, can't go wrong.
Yeah.
Um, you gotta stay sane somehow during these days. There's a lot going on, but listen, Marianne, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on, and I really, really appreciate you taking the time, and wish you the best of luck, and maybe come on again sometime.
Thank you so much, Mike. I would love to do that.
All right, thank you.
Cheers.